Jesus told Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." On the authority of that promise, the Roman Church has named its popes. But what did Jesus really mean? That Peter's faith was so solid, so unshakable, that it could bear the weight of the church? But the Gospels tell us just as much about Peter's failures as they do about his faith, his impulsiveness, his misunderstandings, even his denial of Jesus.
So, what is this rock on which the church is built? In our Lenten sermon series, On This Rock, we will get to know Peter more deeply, in both his faith and his fear. Join us at Second Presbyterian Church Roanoke this Lent, as we seek to understand not only what Jesus was saying about Peter, but also what he is saying about us, that God builds the church not on perfection, but on grace-filled, imperfect faith.
Let's pray. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I remember comments that were made that still make me cringe. Here's one that goes back 3 decades. I was at church, not this church, another church that I served, talking with 2 others, an older gentleman and a younger woman. I knew them both well. He made what he thought was a funny remark about her, but it landed hard. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her face. We didn't have the language for it back then, but it was the kind of comment that we might call today body shaming. Now, it was so long ago, she might not even remember it, but I do, and it still makes me cringe. Because some words don't just pass, they linger. They change the air in the room. The passage I'm about to read has a moment like that. Just before it, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus praises him, calls him the rock, gives him the keys to the kingdom. It's a high point. And then Jesus keeps talking. Listen. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." It's worth pausing here because after a moment like that, after words like that, it's hard to hear anything else. Elizabeth, could you go check on Peter and see how he's doing? Somebody needs to talk to Jesus. He's not himself. He doesn't talk that way. Only he keeps talking. Listen. "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up the cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done." The word of the Lord. Now, most all of us are Christians in this room, so we're supposed to take Jesus' side in disputes, aren't we? And very often that's not hard to do. I mean, when he stands between a mob with stones and a vulnerable woman, or when he pushes back against religious leaders who value rules over healing, or insists that a hungry crowd should be fed instead of being sent away. In moments like that, it's easy to stand with Jesus. But that story, that's different. Because if I'm honest, my instinct is to rush to Peter's defense, not Jesus. I mean, that was harsh. This is the same Peter who just confessed that Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus told him that he was right. And now, moments after Jesus says that powerful people will make sure that he is arrested, suffered, and killed, Peter pulls him inside and says, "No, Jesus, that can't happen. There has to be another way." Honestly, doesn't that sound like care? Like friendship? Like someone trying to protect the person that he loves? And Jesus calls him Satan. Jesus calls something that sounds loving satanic. And to put a little salt on the wound, Peter is rebuked right at the point of his believing that Jesus is the Messiah. And the air feels different now. And you heard Jesus went on talking, but how could anybody hear what he had to say? How can anybody hear anything that comes after that? It's like trying to carry on a group conversation after somebody storms out and slams the door. Get behind me, Satan. Can you imagine? How do you hear anything after that? Now, a scholar might move quickly past the personal sting and go straight to the theology of the passage. But I'm not just a scholar with thoughts. I'm a person with feelings. So maybe we need to walk out of the room of the passage for a moment. Step outside. Be mindful. Take a deep breath. Let the shock settle. Disengage the amygdala, part of our brain that was engaged. And then maybe we can walk back into the room and focus not on what Peter is doing. We can get back to Peter, but on what is going on with Jesus. Because Jesus sounded so triggered. I mean, I probably shouldn't put it that way. It sounds trendy. And I also know that the Gospel of Matthew, in telling this story, does have a larger theological point to make. He wants us to understand that Jesus is being intentional here. This wasn't just him snapping, not impulsive, but saying something that Peter needs to hear, that we need to hear. So having taken a moment, let's not feel that we have to go back into the room of the passage and be mediators and soften the passage by telling Peter Jesus didn't really mean it, or telling Jesus that he overreacted and he needs to go apologize. Let's take that deep breath, go back into the room, and try to understand where Jesus is coming from. Because it may be that Jesus isn't reacting impulsively at all. It may be that he is naming something that gets in the way of what he needs to do, what he needs to face, and very much does not want to face. So why would Jesus call Peter Satan when Peter is simply saying he doesn't want Jesus to suffer, doesn't want Jesus to die? Peter is not Satan. We know that. Jesus knows that. But if we think back in Matthew's gospel, if we think back to where Jesus has been, we'll remember that he's heard this voice before in the wilderness after the baptism. Jesus goes into the wilderness to fast and pray, and there he is tempted by Satan 3 times. One temptation is to turn stones into bread, to use his power to meet his own needs rather than trust God. Another is to throw himself down from the temple and let angels catch him, proving that God will protect him from harm and from suffering and even save him from death. And the final one is to gain all the kingdoms of the world without the cross, to take the crown without suffering. 3 different temptations, but all pointing in the same direction. A way of being the Messiah that avoids suffering, avoids surrender, avoids the cross. And now Peter speaks, and it sounds like love. But to Jesus, it sounds like that same temptation all over again. A way around the cross, a way to follow God without the cost. You know, the most compelling temptations we face don't usually come from dark, sinister places. It's not always that obvious. It's not always the kind of temptation that we can recognize right away, like being tempted to take what isn't yours or to hurt someone just because you can get something out of it. Sometimes the most powerful temptations come wrapped in good intentions. Sounds like care, feels like kindness. What a temptation it is for a parent to spare a child from consequences, to step in too quickly, to shield them from struggle, to keep them from pain. It feels loving. And yet, see, the thing is that Jesus knows what is ahead of him. He names it plainly for the disciples. He sees it coming: suffering, rejection, arrest, death. He even calls it the will of God. Not because suffering itself is good or because his death is something magical and has nothing to do with what's going on around him, has nothing to do with life as we live it, but because Jesus' eyes, they're wide open. He knows that if he continues to live and speak the truth of God's kingdom, there is going to be a cost because he can see it coming. He can see the powers already aligned against him. Religious leaders, political leaders, people invested in keeping things the way that they are. And Jesus sees clearly that if he stays on this path, it will lead to the cross. This road is not an accident, and it's not avoidable. Unless Peter gets his way. Unless Jesus listens to him and pulls back, softens the message, stops confronting what needs to be confronted, become the kind of Messiah that people are comfortable with. That sounds like care for him. That sounds like love. But it would mean abandoning the very thing that he came to do. Because he's not the sort of Messiah that Peter believes in at this point of time. The one who succeeds, the one who is victorious, the one who conquers, the one who defeats evil so that all good may reign. No, he's the Messiah who suffers because the world is the way it is. Because love can't help but suffer when the world is the way it is. And that's when this passage moves toward us. Because most of us, we're in a sanctuary worshiping God. Most of us are not tempted to do terrible things, are we? Do evil, be destructive on purpose. We're not waking up in the morning wondering how we might hurt others for our own gain. We're trying to be good people. Faithful people, loving people, do right by our family, by our friends, our community. And yet, how often are we tempted to avoid the hard conversation because we don't want to hurt another's feelings? How often are we tempted to stay quiet about something that really matters because we don't want to create tension? How often do we settle for keeping the peace instead of doing the harder, difficult work of making peace? It feels loving, but sometimes it's just easier. Or think about this. How often do we pull back from doing something that we know is right because it might cost us something? Our reputation, a relationship we care about, a sense of control. So we delay obedience. We soften the truth. We tell ourselves this isn't the right time. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes that's right. Often reasonable, often wise. But sometimes it's just another way of saying this path is too hard. And that's exactly what Peter is saying when he says to Jesus, you don't have to do this. There's another way. There's got to be another way. Jesus hears the concern. And also the temptation wrapped in the concern. Find another way around the cross. Maybe now we can invite Peter back into the room because he's not being singled out anymore. Because this rebuke isn't just for him, it's for us when the path feels too hard. And it shows up in small and ordinary ways. When we know we need to say something that is true, but we soften it so much that it's not true anymore. When we need to have a hard conversation and we keep putting it off. When we sense God is calling us to step into something and we quietly step back instead. When we think that we're being kind, when we're really just being careful. Not because we don't care, but because it might cost us. So we share Peter's struggle to follow a Messiah who suffers. But here's some hope. Not today when Peter is still stinging from the rebuke, but one day Peter's going to understand. He will see why the cross could not be avoided, and he will discover that following Jesus in a life that is shaped by compassion and justice and reconciliation, which always brings sacrifice, which always brings cost, which so often brings suffering, that it comes with the cross, he'll find when that day comes that he's not following reluctantly because the path is too hard. He'll be following with joy because that is the path of life with God. And the air will feel different for him, not with the weight of words that wound him, but with the freedom of a life given in love. Because the one who rebukes him is also the one who calls him, not to avoid the cross, but to share in the life that comes through and beyond the cross. He will understand. And maybe by the grace of God, so will we.
Second Presbyterian, finding direction by following Jesus.